As we discuss trade, it becomes really interesting to see how South Africa and Africa has certainly involved in whether the way we do things, the way we trade, the things we do trade. What are sort of the trends that you're sort of noticing?
Thanks, Arabile, for having me. So some of the big trends is actually the fact that trade is global by definition. So any discussion on trade, especially now, cannot avoid but talk about what's happening between US and China. In a very strange way, it's actually an indication of a bigger trend, which is about localizing supply chains. And I wouldn't say reversing, but the 2-decade trend of globalization slowing down. A lot of people look at this as negative, but we and I in particular actually think there's a positive in this. And the positive is that when US and China compete with each other and they reduce their trade with each other, it's opportunity for us in Africa to do more trade with both US and China.
Yeah, and I mean, it changes the relationships, right? We have to find new ways to do it. But the global economy then, for instance, now particularly slowing down in many ways, how does that then impact on things like trade? We have to find other ways, surely.
So you're right. The slowing down of global economies almost has a direct impact on trade. I mean, the very simple thing I use is, if there is a slowdown in China, there is a lesser demand for soybeans and hence lesser soybean export. And the same thing applies for wine, same thing applies for flowers from Kenya, and the same thing applies for commodities. But that's a nice segue to talk about a second trend, which is the demand for goods in our markets being met by manufacturing in our markets. Rather than looking towards manufacturing in China reducing the cost and hence increasing the demand, now a clear trend is that, and that's what I mean by localization of supply chain. Using textiles, because fashion is a great, shall I say, leveler. You need to be close to the market to be able to produce the goods. So it's not just enough that you can produce the goods cheaper, you need to actually produce the right goods. And I think that is the opportunity. The opportunity is for us to, and all our markets to diversify our economy away from being single commodity exporters, in some cases, to actually getting into up the value chain, for lack of better words, manufacturing, tourism, healthcare, and so on and so forth.
Are you finding that that's the reason you have things like the Africa Free Trade Agreement? That is because we're trying to move up the value chain and enhance each other?
Certainly. But the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement actually is an idea whose time has come. Yeah. So few, shall I say, build-ups to this. The first data point I would use is intra-Africa trade. The best estimate of that says that intra-Africa trade is 17%. That's 17%. In other words, we do more trade with outside the continent to the tune of 83%. If you looked at similar regions, so if you looked at Asia, it's at 60%. You look at Europe, it's over 60%. So there is so much of opportunity in increasing intra-Africa trade. And the reason it was not happening was because of logistics, tariffs, what I call the hardware. And that's what the African Free Trade Agreement, or what I call the Continental African Free Trade Agreement, is addressing. Reducing the cost of doing business with each other, reducing tariffs, easing infrastructure, and improving the hardware of intra-Africa trade.
WEF Africa 2019, brought to you by Standard Bank 702 and Cape Talk. More at ewn.co.za.